Hey everybody, welcome back. It's the Stick Figure Historian, and we're jumping into episode 26 of the England series. It was a sad day in Britain when King Charles raised his standard at Nottingham. The country was now rift in two. This was a civil war, by far the worst kind of warfare in this world. Men who had once been friends and neighbors now stood as mortal enemies, simply because they disagreed on politics. Most of the northwest turned out in arms for the king, including Wales, but the southeast held out for Parliament. Of course, it wasn't exactly a clean cut. There were Royalists in the southeast too, and parliamentarians in the northwest. There were even some people that didn't take any side. So, it's a generalization when I tell you the country was split in two. Parliament responded to Charles' declaration of war by getting their army in order as well. They appointed Robert Devereux, Earl of Essex, as the chief commander of their forces. Old Robin, his troops came to fondly call him. Kinda like Robin Hood, I guess, but not as cool. There were not any big battles in this war at first, but many little ones as local armies tried to take control of towns and fortresses before the other side could. But as Charles marched about, gathering more troops to swell his ranks, Parliament grew uneasy. No doubt they feared the king was preparing to march on London, which indeed he was. Old Robin and his men sallied out to meet him before he could attack the city. Nice try, dude, but you're just never gonna be that cool. Now, there was at this time a small group of Royalist cavalry who were also traveling to meet the king. They had come from Oxford, Charles's new headquarters, and were bearing much needed money and valuable goods, things donated from the great university in that city, to help pay for the things that the king and his army would need. And as chance would have it, the Earl of Essex path now crossed with their own. The Royalist commander, Sir John Byron, was afraid. The Earl's army was much bigger than his little band of troops, and he was sure he would be defeated. He hurried his men away into the nearby town of Worcester and shut the gates. But this was only a temporary protection. Byron had avoided a battle, but now the Roundheads surrounded the place. And just a note here, Roundheads was just another name for the Parliament troops. They were called this because, unlike the Royalists, who often wore their hair rather long, the Parliament troops usually cut their hair short, hence the name. It didn't have anything to do with wearing melons on their heads or anything like that. Anyway, with the Roundheads surrounding Worcester, it was all one and the same as if the Royalists inside had been killed, for they still could not bring the treasure to the king. All hope was not lost, however. You see, King Charles had a nephew, Rupert. This young prince had but recently come over from Germany, for he was the son of a German prince, his mother being Charles' sister Elizabeth, to help his uncle win the war. Rupert was very brave and daring, but as some young people are wont to be, he was also rather reckless and headstrong. We shall come to see in time how these last two qualities often brought himself, among others, much trouble. But for now, we'll look at the virtuous qualities and how they work some good in our tale. When Rupert heard of the trouble the Royalist commander was in, he called together his little band of cavalry and dragoons and hurried off to the rescue. And these were not dragons, as you may suppose I mean, but dragoons. Dragoons were soldiers that rode their horses into battle, but dismounted them when the time came to fight. So, like I was saying, calling his troops together, Rupert hurried off to the rescue. And rescue them he did. The Roundheads had failed to keep a good watch upon Worcester, leaving a way for Rupert and his men to slip inside to their friends. The next morning, when the Parliament men began to march across Powick Bridge to storm the city, they met with quite a surprise. Rupert was there, ready and waiting for them. The Roundheads were pressed so sorely by this unexpected force that they eventually turned and fled from the city. Rupert chased them for some time, but even when he at last called his men back, the Parliament troops still ran on for some miles, convinced in their terror that the prince was still upon their heels. And thus the way was cleared for Byron and his little band to bring the treasure to the king. Old Robin was frustrated at the loss of this treasure, but nevertheless, he pressed on with his previous mission and advanced to meet King Charles in the open field. The two great armies met at last near Edgehill, one of the many hills in England, only this one must have been rather significant, therefore it had a name. And pictured here is a castle built on the site, but this was actually built in the 1740s, so it wouldn't have been there at the time. Unfortunately, I can't seem to get a good picture of the actual battlefield for you. As any wise king usually does before a battle is had, Charles called his commanders together and asked their opinions and advice on how matters should be done. Lord Lindsay, his chief commander, brought forth his plan first. It was a good one, for he was an older man and used to the ways of war. He had also fought in the Netherlands alongside old Robin, and was therefore a good judge of that commander's way of fighting. Lindsay advised the king towards caution, stating that they should merely try to hold their ground on the hill. Prince Rupert, however, was very displeased with the idea, which, as you can see, the artist has done a rather good job of depicting. He preferred an aggressive approach. He too had served in war, the 30 Years' War, in the cavalry forces under the great commander King Gustavus Adolphus of Sweden. He loved the Swedish cavalry tactics, for these were bold and daring, so much after his own heart. Lord Lindsay tried to reason with the prince and show him the error of his way in this case, but he would hear none of it. And Rupert's willful nature now came further into play as he pressed the king to accept his plan. But Charles needed not much persuasion. He too was of a similar disposition. He was also probably swayed by the fact that Rupert was his nephew, and after much heated discussion, it was the prince's method that was adopted. Adopted much to Lord Lindsay's displeasure. He was so angry with the king that he resigned his position as chief commander and descended to his old rank of colonel. Charles fretted little over the matter, simply taking the reins of the army in his own hands. But our story has been long, therefore we'll save the tale of the coming battle for a future time.